Do you ever wonder how a spider's web is formed? You can look it up. You can check it out. The spider's web has a whole anatomical significance. You can go through and identify each of the parts. Let me show you how I think these things shape up. You have anchor points of various sort. There's an anchor point on your screen right now, a little abject A. And anchor points extend across a whole range of surfaces. You name your surface and a spider can turn it into an anchor point. Each of these anchor points becomes the origin of a thread. There are different types of threads when it comes to spider webs, but notice the one we're drawing now. The analytic discourse is every bit a spider's web, just as we heard Lacan describing it on page 93 of our text. This analytic spider's web in which bodies are invisibly held. It's a good place for us to start as we continue this discussion of chapters 8 and 9 in Seminar 20. Why? Because with the addition of this psychoanalytic spider's web, I think we're now ready to discuss corporal knowledge, and with it the second subset of knowledge in Seminar 20, not the said, but the act and fact of saying. So in addition to this spider's web, let's recall the odd family tree that we were drawing last time. And I'm just going to use letters to symbolize what we're doing here. So there's a K up on the screen right now. There's knowledge. And I told you that it has two parts. There's the said, and then there's the saying. These are subsets of knowledge. Within the said, you have two other subsets that we discussed last time. There's conscious knowledge, and then there's unconscious knowledge. And then within the field of unconscious knowledge, we have two more subsets, as you well know. There is what is knowable, and then there is what is unknowable. And you'll notice how this lines up with conscious knowledge. Conscious knowledge is about what is known, and unconscious knowledge is about unknown knowledge that can become known, there's your knowable, and cannot become known, there's your unknowable. The unconscious always has these two facets. Notice we are springing out from knowledge to the said, and then we've got conscious and unconscious knowledge. Conscious knowledge is about what is known. Unconscious knowledge is about an unknown that is knowable, but also a part of the unknown that remains so. Now, the other side of knowledge that we're going to discuss is that of the saying. Here we see another CK to write up on the board, but this isn't conscious knowledge that we're working with here. It's corporal knowledge. So I'm going to write it up. I have this on the board so that you can see what effectively amounts to, my friends, yet another spider's web. Conscious and unconscious knowledge, as we know, are both functions of what is said. But corporal knowledge, that we now have up on the screen, is a function of something far more elusive, but also, when you think about it, far more obvious. It's about speaking bodies. Bodies that know just that. They speak. You want to know what corporal knowledge amounts to, as we're going to see? Bodies knowing that they speak. We'll get to it. The bodies in question here are the same speaking bodies that are invisibly held by the matheme, in which we also see the real acceding to the symbolic. So remember, the matheme we're talking about here is that of analytic discourse. And you see these speaking bodies, I'm telling you, held invisibly by the various threads of this discourse. The same discourse in which the real accedes to the symbolic. So let's start with the diagram before us. the one in which I just added, once more, the delta of impotence raised to the status of an impossibility to mark the impasse of formalization in which the real as a figure can be inscribed. The figure of the real, not the real itself. And seriously, I do want you to envision this as a spider's web. Little a slashed S, S1, S2. You just heard me describe them as what they are. They're anchor points between which various threads are stretched, discursive threads. Notice the anchor points at the top, little a and slashed S, they are subjects. Little a and slashed S are subject positions. Specifically, we see that of the abject analyst and the desirous analysand. The two top anchor points are subjects. What about the two at the bottom? The anchor points at the bottom, that S1 and that S2, they are both seds. Not subjects, but seds. Specifically, the dimension of truth, of unconscious truth, in which certain parts of truth can be said and known. Here is that S1. But also certain parts that cannot be said and known. Here is S2 as the part of unconscious truth that cannot be said and known. Which is also, don't forget, why it's impossible to tell the whole truth. Lacan is hot once more on this discussion of the whole truth here at the end of Seminar 20. Don't get all hung up on it. It's not more complicated than what you say when you lay your hand on a Bible. For us, right now, it's the vectors between these anchor points, little a slashed S, S1, and S2. It's the vectors between them, the threads extending from these anchor points in our analytic spider's web. This is where speaking bodies are invisibly held, just like buzzing flies. In the vector extending from analysand to symptom, so here is the downward right-hand side vector from slashed S to S1. In this vector extending from the subject known as the analysand and the sed known as the symptom, we find the speaking body of the one improperly called the patient. And I put a little dot on that vector to mark it for you. This is the speaking body of the analysand, the one improperly referred to as a patient. And in the vector extending from analyst to analysand, the top vector pointed right, that of addressivity we've often discussed it as, here we discover the speaking body of the one who all too often resists abjection, namely the analyst. And I put another yellow dot on that line so that you can see it. These are the speaking bodies of analysand and analyst suspended in the threads of this psychoanalytic web. Now, what can we say about the acts of embodied speech that occur here in these vectors? First, these acts of speaking occur without speakers knowing it. That's important. It's something we're going to explain. Analysand and analyst alike speak with their bodies, and they do so unbeknownst to themselves as subjects. So notice this. They speak with their bodies unbeknownst to themselves as subjects. So do you and I. In some sense, there's a very obvious insight here. Second point that I want to get at here about these acts of embodied speech that you see in the yellow dots on your screen. Second point is that as a result of this unbeknownstness, these speakers always inevitably say more than they know. Analysand and analyst are always saying more than they know. Again, just like you and me. So, you want to know what defines someone as a Lacanian? Sounds like the beginning of a joke. I don't tell no jokes. Here is one key indicator. One of the key indicators of a Lacanian is a keen awareness, even if only in moments, of the fact that saying exceeds knowing. And you want to know what makes these Lacanians mystics as well? Now, I'm not saying every Lacanian is a mystic, on the contrary, but that is precisely what Lacan said he is, a mystic as well. The mystic Lacanian is the one who enjoys such sayings. So the Lacanian is the one that realizes saying exceeds knowing, and the mystic Lacanian is the one who enjoys sayings that exceed knowing. We'll come to all this in a minute, mark my words. But for now, let's stick with the basic communicative and wonderfully existential fact that saying exceeds knowing. Let's just stick with this one for a minute. Remember what Lacan says at the start of chapter 10 in seminar 20. A saying that he says recalls that of his previous lesson, one of the lessons we're considering here. It's on page 119, and again, we're not there yet. We're still looking at the previous chapters, but I want you to have your finger on this thing, especially in its broader context. It's on page 119, just at the start of chapter 10. We're going to come to it very soon. We've talked about it before. I want to have the broader context on your radar now. This is one of the essential things I said last time, Lacan begins. Analysis can be distinguished from everything that was produced by discourse prior to analysis by the fact that it enunciates the following, which is the very backbone of my teaching. Here it is. The very backbone of Lacan's teaching is based on the following enunciation. And that's one you've heard before and one that I just paraphrased for you. I speak without knowing it. I speak with my body, and I do so unbeknownst to myself. Thus, I always say more than I know. Page 119, check it out. And note, when you do, we are not talking about signifiers here, much less signifieds. This is about bodies. Bodies over signifiers over signifieds. You want to know the hierarchy at work in corporal knowledge? It is this. Bodies trump signifiers trump signifieds. Now you've heard me issue a hierarchy for each of the other forms of knowledge up here. For conscious knowledge, signifieds trump signifiers trump bodies. For unconscious knowledge, signifiers trump signifieds trump bodies. In corporal knowledge, we see conscious knowledge inverted. Speaking bodies trump signifiers trump signifieds. How then do bodies speak? And in speaking, say more than speakers know? In a simple way, we could answer the question by saying with their mouths. That's how bodies speak. But also with their eyes, their ears, their hands, their skin, their feet, their genitals, their pheromones, and the like. When bodies speak in ways that exceed knowledge, they do so non-verbally, we're tempted to conclude, even paralinguistically, which sometimes is included as a nonverbal communication code, but I think stands on its own. Paralanguage is for the contours of the voice. It's not just the mouth that speaks, but it's the grain of the voice as well. At which point, you may be tempted to think that you know what corporal knowledge is. Doesn't this precisely comport with what we've heard so far about it? Rooted in embodied, affective, sensory experience. That sounds like nonverbal comm to me. Lived experience, as the phenomenologists used to say. You might think that it's the type of knowledge you feel in your bones, in your heart, in your gut, and the like, just as I said, and you wouldn't be wrong. Here we are probably talking about the kind of knowledge, in short, that you can simply sense. This is all true enough, but also not enough. We are still, notice this, on the question of how. We're asking, how do bodies speak? How do bodies know? This is not primarily what is at stake for Lacan. What's at stake for him is not simply the question of how, but also more precisely the fact that. The fact that bodies speak, the fact that bodies know. This is what Lacan is puzzling through at this point in Seminar 20, us as well. And it's a puzzle on which he's been working since Ch8-9b and throughout Seminar 20, ourselves as well. Recall once more that key sentence, a saying really from Ch8-9b, the one Lacan started writing on the blackboard at Seminar 19, and the one that's been repeatedly popping up since the start of Seminar 20, the one that for Lacan, the front part of which matters most. And the saying goes like this: that one may say remains forgotten behind what is said in what is heard. We've studied this sentence before, backwards and forwards, and I think we have made indeed good sense of it. But it's this first part that concerns us here, as you heard me say in the last lecture, and as I want to reiterate here. That one may say. That's the important part. Forget about the rest for now. That one may say is what's at stake here. And it's the stake that still has me thinking with regard to this saying. Qu'on dise, as you say it in the French. That's the French, and you can translate it any which way you want. Note, for instance, how Bruce renders it on page 15 of Seminar 20, when Lacan first brings up this saying, this famous sentence. Bruce renders it as the fact that one says. I think that's pretty accurate. It's not literal. It's not a literal translation, but it's an accurate translation. The fact that one says remains forgotten behind what is said in what is heard. That's a pretty good way to translate this thing. Now check this out. You're on page 15. Now blast forward about 100 pages or so to chapter 9, page 111 in particular, where Lacan is stressing his choice of words, just as you heard me quote him last time. I didn't say the saying remains forgotten, and so on, Lacan tells his audience. I said the fact that one says. Now you'll recall this on page 111. Lacan is telling everybody go back and read Ch8-9b and note that opening sentence. The gambit of the essay is the fact that one says. This is what puts us on the trail of the speaking body, and with it corporal knowledge. So check it out. We know how the body speaks, non-verbally, paralinguistically, ever encore with a space between the N and the C. And we know how it knows, even where it knows, in its bones again, encore. But what exactly does the speaking body know? What does the speaking body know when it speaks, when it says? That it's speaking. It's as simple as that. What does the speaking body know? It knows that it's speaking, that it is saying. What's forgotten behind what is said in what is heard is the very thing that each and every speaking body recalls. The fact that it speaks, the fact that it says, and again, encore, and again with a space between the N and the C. Which is precisely, but not solely, why corporal knowledge differs from conscious and unconscious knowledge alike. Conscious knowledge and unconscious knowledge are both dimensions, we've learned, spelled with a DIT for the said, as we've discovered. One, conscious knowledge, privileges signifieds, and the other, unconscious knowledge, privileges signifiers. But check it out. Both are fundamentally structured atop and around what is said, the D of the D mention. That's the key part here. Conscious knowledge privileges signifieds, and unconscious knowledge privileges signifiers, but they're both fundamentally about what is said. Corporal knowledge, note the difference. It subordinates both of these dimensions, conscious and unconscious knowledge alike, to the very thing that they often mutually neglect, the body that speaks, says more than either dimension knows, and never tires of saying just that, to selves, others, epistemes alike. Corporal knowledge subordinates both of these dimensions that we discussed last time to the very thing that they all too often neglect, the body that speaks, and in speaking says more than either of these dimensions knows, and the body that never tires of saying precisely that, to themselves, to others, and every epistemology that walks through their door. And what does it sound like when the body that speaks says more than either dimension knows, to selves, others, and epistemes alike? It sounds something like this. I speak unbeknownst to you. I know this about myself. I also speak in excess of you, and know this about myself as well. And I say all of this to remind you of what you all too often forget, the act and fact of embodied speech. Mystics around every corner, it seems. You know what the mantra of consciousness is? I think you probably do. I think, therefore I am. All right, let's take it up a notch. Do you know the mantra of the unconscious? Again, I think you do. I am thinking where I am not. Therefore, I am where I'm not thinking. The first mantra is from Descartes, and the second, as you probably well know, is from Lacan. But don't forget, it's 1957 Lacan that gives us that mantra for the unconscious. Here, in Seminar 20, 16 years later, almost to the day, in the final lessons of this key text in Lacanian Psychoanalysis, our boy is on the verge of another mantra, this one for corporality. You know the mantra for consciousness. You know the mantra for the unconscious. We're on the verge of developing one for corporality, for that body which speaks. Kundis in the French. That one says. The fact that one says. The fact that there are beings who speak. Bodies that speak. Yours and mine alike. Like I said, we're on the verge. I didn't say we had one. I said we're on the verge of a mantra that starts with kundis, with that one says, the fact that one says, the fact that there are bodies who speak, bodies that speak, and that they're yours and mine alike. This is what we've got so far. And at this stage, I got to be honest with you, this may be as much as we can handle on account of the basic structural differences between corporal knowledge and its conscious and unconscious siblings. So rather than push for another mantra, I want to hit you with a definition instead. It's a tentative, working definition of corporal knowledge. And it goes like this. Corporal knowledge is knowledge without a subject, but not without a body. The speaking body here, it's not a conscious subject, but nor is it a subject of the unconscious. It is a body that knows, to be sure, What then does it know? Again, it knows that it speaks. It knows that it says, and nothing more. To be sure, the speaking body of corporal knowledge is related to the thinking subject of conscious knowledge and the far more thoughtful subject of unconscious knowledge, but it is irreducible to either subject, which is why I tell you, corporal knowledge is knowledge without a subject, but it is not without a body. So, how then exactly is corporal knowledge related to conscious and unconscious subjectivity? Why, the same way the real is related to truth, and the same way the saying is related to the said, existentially. Insistence from without, from the outside, that's the logic of existence that we're working with here. Relative to the thinking subjects of conscious and unconscious knowledge, the speaking body exists, making its demands felt with a certain insistence from without. In short, its sayings always exceed and affect their saids. I love these riffs. But I still got one key question here. A question that's been keeping me up. It's a wild card in all of this. And it seems to me to be not the body, but its act and fact of speaking. And maybe for you, you got it all figured out. Ultimately, I'm a communication scholar. That's what my training is in. The history and philosophy of communication. I got hung up on speaking in all of this. The body, okay, but the body that speaks? What's this wild card, speech, that gets thrown around in here? You see, Lacan, in my view, has had the body dialed in for quite a while now, ever since Seminar 17, where he tells us at the start that the body is the living individual that receives the mark of subjectivity. You want a theory of the Lacanian body? He gives it to you point blank right there at the start of Seminar 17. The body is the living individual that receives the mark of subjectivity. But what about this act and fact of speaking, Encore? Now that is something baffling. In Ch8-9b, Lacan tells us that the act and fact of speaking, of saying, dear, is, quote, the wail of an appeal to the real. It's a great phrase. It's even got a little bit of a jingle to it. The wail of an appeal to the real, as it comes to us in the English. This is what the saying is. It's the wail of an appeal to the real. And now you may realize what you already knew to be true. The reason why I used yellow to mark those speaking bodies held invisibly in the analytic spider web that's on your screen right now, the same yellow that I used to draw the figure of the real as an impasse of formalization, also in the same diagram, is because those little yellow dots of speaking body, when they speak, they issue wails of appeals to the real. They don't point to S2 if you want to connect these dots. They point to the real. The same real that Lacan tells us on page 93 in that passage we ended our last lecture with, the same real that accedes to the symbolic in the analytic discourse. And that is exactly what you see on your screen. These acts and facts of speaking that you see marked with yellow dots, they appeal to a real that accedes to the symbolic in analytic discourse. Here, just a few months later, after telling us all of this and quite a bit more in Ch8-9b, here in Chapter 8 of Seminar 20, just after the passage about this analytic spider's web that we discussed last time, Lacan provides us with a crucial bit of additional information. The speaking body, in its appeal to the real, he tells us, is a corporal contingency. It's on page 93 at the bottom, page 86 in the French. The speaking body in its appeal to the real is a corporal contingency. And you know what this fella means by contingency at this point. It is that which stops not being written. Notice, quoting, "It is in this stops not being written," Lacan says, "that resides the apex of what I have called contingency." He's explicit about this. So, if the necessary is what doesn't stop being written, and the impossible is that which does not stop not being written, I can't help but wonder, maybe the contingent is an adjunct of the impossible that has the ability to stop not being written. In which case, recalling the previous lecture in this series, maybe we're talking about possibility here. The contingent, you heard me say, in my reading of chapter 6 in particular, is what happens when possibility gives way to actuality. Like when it rains, or when we get together for our next live discussion, which is coming up this Friday, so I'm looking forward to it. But you know what? If you're listening to this after the date, who knows when the next live discussion is going to be? That's the nature of contingency. The contingent is what is, but didn't have to be. The magic of human togetherness is the fact that it is contingent. When it rains, when we get together, when that mystic sitting next to you on the bus starts to speak, it happens, but it didn't have to. That's why it's magical. And recall the diagram work we did to illustrate all of this. Note, relative to feminine subjectivity. It was diagram work that allowed us to flesh out a simple saying that now you've heard for the 1,000th time. Some, but not all, of her enjoyment can and does show up in the phallic field, passing from the field of possibility to that of actuality. So let's choose a different color and let's just keep adding to what we've got here. Recall how we drew this. We had two circles, and I'll use some different colors here to make things pop if I can. We started with two separate circles to try and illustrate this. This is really some retrospective stuff that we're doing, if you think about it. I'm going to put it this way for purposes of clarity. So you've got two circles, an orange one here on the left with the half moon of the necessary in it, with the half moon of masculine subjectivity in it. And then you've got this pink circle. Yes, I used pink because I love pink on the right. And this is the circle of femininity. This is before they intersect. This is just for illustrative purposes. And I can label them in ways that I think are helpful here. The orange circle is a circle of actuality. We know it as the phallic field, but I like it as a circle of actuality. You can make a lot of this just by thinking modally with this business. The pink circle to the right, we can call it one of potentiality. Modality helps a lot with this. Lacan is not wrong about that. His work with the modals are messed up, don't get me wrong, but he's got something. He knows there's a fish on the line when he's moving towards modality here. And we're just trying to be as true as possible to his thought, even where our boy himself seems to slip up, and I think he does. Notice what happens next. In order to arrive at the diagram with which this series began, those two intersecting circles, in the phallic field where all of his enjoyment is contained, but only some of hers shows up. What we did was we took the pink circle and we merged it with the orange. Notice, I'm just showing you as I draw here what happens when you bring these together. This is the more accurate description of what's happening. Notice, the two circles are no longer separate. Now they are Euler circles intersecting. And that's the key point in all of this diagram. In the field of actuality, we now see all masculine enjoyment and some of hers. And we can label these things in ways that are pretty damn clarifying. So, the masculine enjoyments we've discussed, they are necessary. I write it with an N here so that you can see. The part of her enjoyment that does not show up in the phallic field, this is impossible. I write it with an I. And what do we call the part of feminine enjoyment that shows up when it shows up, as it shows up in the phallic field? This is the realm of contingency. NCI, that's how this model should be labeled. This is the NCI diagram. In that middle, where some but not all of her enjoyment shows itself to be governed by the phallic function, you see a contingent event. And what I'm telling you here, what we're adding to this, what Lacan gives us at the bottom of page 93, is that it is a corporal contingency. When she shows up Encore, with a space between the N and the C. What I'm adding here, to just drive this home, is just building on stuff we already know. It's that the modality in which some but not all of her enjoyment shows itself to be governed by the phallic function is not just contingent, but also more specifically corporally contingent. With this clarification, with this addition of corporal contingency, I think we've reached the limit of Lacan's thought at this point in the spring of 1973. And I'm serious. I don't know where he's going to go next. I haven't read chapter 10 and the final chapter, all that stuff. But with corporal contingency, I think he's really thinking out. He's right there at the edge. This is as far as his thought has gone at this point, on my reading. Now, you might say, no. Our master knows no limits. But I'm telling you, as a reader of Lacan, it seems to me, in the spring of 1973, corporal contingency is the inner limit of his thought. He hasn't yet stepped out of bounds, but he is finding the limit of his thought at this point, it seems to me. And this is where great things tend to happen. Ever with Lacan, it's always at the limit of things where we see great insights occurring, and with your thought as well. With this corporal contingency as the inner limit of Lacan's thought, I think we finally start to arrive at that economy of jouissance that we've been driving toward, especially as it relates to feminine enjoyment. Now, we're not there yet, but we're getting damn close to this economy of jouissance. And I think Lacan senses this in his own thought as well. Check out, for instance, page 116. It's toward the bottom, where he introduces this economy of jouissance. I told you that these chapters are bookended by the overhaul of knowledge that is characteristically Freudian, and the discovery of an economy of jouissance therein that is uniquely Lacanian. Here we're at that second bookend. We've talked about knowledge, conscious, unconscious, and corporal. Here we are now arriving at that other bookend at the end of chapter 9. Contingency, corporal contingency that puts us in touch with an economy of jouissance. That is what you see on your screen with that NCI. We are edging towards an economy of jouissance. Check it out. Bottom of 116. The economy of jouissance is something we can't yet put our fingertips on. You see, Lacan knows he's on the edge. We're on the edge with him. This economy of jouissance is something we cannot yet put our fingertips on. It would be of some interest if we managed to do so. What we can see on the basis of analytic discourse is that we may have a slight chance of finding out something about it from time to time by pathways that are essentially contingent. Check that out. We're on the verge of this economy of jouissance, but we're not there. But what we can see if we look at the analytic discourse, he says, is we see some pathways that are essentially contingent and give us a chance of finding out something about this economy of jouissance. So here, take another look at that spider's web and ask yourself how the spider moves through it. The flies that are caught, held invisibly by the threads between the anchor points you see in this analytic spider's web. These are the pathways by which the spider herself travels. The pathways that you see in the analytic discourse are essentially contingent, two in particular. And Lacan thinks that if we travel these pathways, these twisted pathways, these vectors between subjects and seds, that we can get a grasp on what now our fingertips can only touch, the economy of jouissance. That's where we find ourselves at this point, at the outer or inner limit of Lacan's thought. So let's ask the question we've indeed already answered. Which pathways in the analytic discourse are essentially contingent? The same pathways by which the body of the analysand speaks and that of the analyst replies. The pathways I have dotted yellow. These pathways are essentially contingent. From barred subject to symptomatic statement, this vector is essentially contingent and corporally so. And from abject analyst to barred subject, this vector is also essentially contingent, corporally so. Both are pathways of corporal contingency determined by the fact that bodies speak, like buzzing flies invisibly held in a spider's web. Next question. How and to what extent do these insights allow us to put our fingertips on and perhaps even begin to get a grasp of the economy of jouissance in question here? To start, let's follow these vectors of embodied speech in all its corporal contingency back to the subjectivities that they exceed. So start with the yellow dot between /S and S1 and trace it back to the subject that it exceeds, namely the analysand, and then move on to the yellow dot between objet abject little a and /S. Trace that one back to its originating subject that it nevertheless exceeds, namely that of the abject analyst. So you see, the subjectivities to which you can trace these embodied acts of speaking are two: the barred subject and the abject analyst. That's not our stopping point. It's just us moving through the spider's web. We are indeed flies caught in it, but some days we're also spiders. From these subjects, where would we go next? One subject written as little a and the other written /S. From yellow dot to subject to what? Why, to the dimension of truth as knowledge, knowledge in the place of truth that conditions both subjectivities, here represented by the S2 in the diagram's lower left-hand corner. So notice what we're doing here. And I'm going to add some movement here so you can see where we're tracing things back to. We're moving backwards from the embodied speech of the analysand to the subjectivity that it exceeds, that of the analysand, and from there to the unconscious truth, which, as you can see, is conditioning that subjectivity. And we're doing the same for the analyst. Notice, both subjectivities originate in S2, where truth shows up as knowledge. Knowledge in the place of truth. What is this dimension here inscribed as S2? It's that of the unconscious, as you know. The unconscious as a field of unknown knowledge in which the soils of truth are ever being tilled, and the outer limit of its field never found. As we've learned, some of this unknown knowledge can be said and thus known. But most of it cannot be said and thus cannot be known. The part of unconscious knowledge that can be said and can be known shows up as nonsense. There's your S1. There's your symptomatic signifier. There's that bit of nonsense. And the part of it that cannot be said or known, it doesn't show up at all, except in certain figures of absence. You see, nonsense and absence, we're right there on this topic. And guess what, my friends? There's enjoyment to be had here in nonsense and absence alike. Not enjoyment of the one, but enjoyment of the other. Not the necessary enjoyment of masculinity, but the possible, impossible, and contingent enjoyment of the other sex, of the other sexed feminine. Possible, impossible, and contingent enjoyment. Now that is an economy of jouissance. And if you want to know, to recall where we put the possible here, it's up at the top in the diagram of feminine subjectivity that we were working with. The possible is there. So really what you've got is an NCIP, or perhaps an NP turned CI. I don't know how you want to figure this, but notice we are dealing with an economy of jouissance in which some enjoyment is necessary, some enjoyment is impossible, some enjoyment is possible, and when it passes into the field of actuality, it does so contingently. Notice these are the basic modes. We are dealing with a modal field of jouissance. An economy of jouissance indeed. Let's consider each in turn with an eye toward their epistemic foundations. This is the key work. We're going to try and lock some of this stuff in. Unconscious knowledge in the case of possible and impossible enjoyment. That's where we'll start. But I also want to talk about corporal knowledge in the case of contingent enjoyment. Forget about conscious knowledge for now. It's too old, it's too dead, it's fine. Let's focus, though, on unconscious knowledge and corporal knowledge, because I think those are the ones that are the most difficult to distinguish. And perhaps we'll discover, as time goes on, that it was foolish to try to distinguish them to begin with. But I think they are, at this point, still distinct. Unconscious knowledge gives us a clue about how to understand possible and impossible enjoyment, I'm telling you. And corporal knowledge puts us on the trail of contingent enjoyment. Let me tell you how I think this works. Like unconscious knowledge and truth more broadly, I think there are three basic aspects of feminine enjoyment when you look at the diagram on the screen right now. Check it out. There's the part of feminine enjoyment that can appear in the phallic field. And then there's the part that can't. But then there's also the whole to which these parts never quite add up. So, marked with C for contingent is the part of feminine enjoyment that can and does appear in the phallic field. Marked with I for impossibility is the part that can't show up and doesn't show up as a result in the phallic field, contingent and impossible. But notice, there is no plus sign, there is no equal sign, there is no whole to which these parts of feminine enjoyment add up. That third element is the really important one here. Yes, there's the part of enjoyment that shows up. Yes, there's the part that doesn't. What matters, though, is that when you put these two parts together, they don't make a whole. When you put these two parts together, there is no sum in excess of those parts. You still just have a multiplicity. That's what we're edging towards. Some, but not all of her enjoyment lends itself to the phallic function. And as a result, what I'm telling you, her jouissance is never wholly, fully, completely anywhere. It's always a both and. Just as some, but not all, unconscious knowledge lends itself to symptomatic seds, making S2 and S1 ever disjointed. Take a look at the analytic diagram to the left of the diagram of feminine enjoyment that we're looking at here. S2 and S1 have no vector between them. They are ever disjointed, proving that the unconscious is also a multiplicity. The same is true of truth. It can only ever be half said, which again is why we need God's help. Whenever the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth is demanded of us, there's no such thing as the whole truth. There's no such thing as the whole unconscious. There's no such thing as a whole feminine enjoyment. Relative to the phallic function, feminine enjoyment is one part possible, one part impossible, and in no way whole, total, complete, consistent, in short, one. Notice what becomes of each of these three features of feminine enjoyment. The part of feminine enjoyment that can appear in the phallic field does so, thereby passing from possibility to contingency. That's what you see in the diagram on your screen right now. That C marks the part of feminine enjoyment that can and does appear in the phallic field, thus passing from possibility to actuality, from possibility to a contingent existence in the field of actuality. Now, I realize that's kind of wonky, but if you just slow down and stack up each of those terms, I think you'll see what I mean. Simply put, but also in an equally Lacanianly wonky way, it can and does stop not writing itself. And we, my friends, write this just as you might expect, with a backwards capital E, X next to a capital phi X with bars of negation over the top. Here is one of two formulas of feminine enjoyment. It stops not writing itself, and so do we. Here's how we write it. Okay, next, the second feature. What about the part of feminine enjoyment that cannot appear in the phallic field and thus remains beyond it? Well, this one cannot and does not stop not writing itself. That's how Lacan puts it. I'm just working with what I got here, people. But check it out. This, however, does not stop us from writing it. And we absolutely can. And you know exactly how we write this one. With a formula that says not all of her enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. So you see, this one does not stop not writing itself, but that sure as fuck doesn't stop us from writing it in a formula. Nor does it stop feminine subjects from saying as much about this second mode of enjoyment. And this is where things get gooey, but also really, really important. What does it sound like when feminine subjects say as much about this other mode of enjoyment? It sounds like this. There's more to my enjoyment than can be said and known. What does the feminine subject say? The feminine subject says there's more to my enjoyment than can be said and known. Now think carefully with me about this. What we have here, I think, are two contingent half sayings. First, a saying of the half that can be said, which often in the best of times doubles as two, a saying which says there's another half that can't be said. In other words, an other half saying. I'm not saying another, I'm saying an other half. There's an other half that we also say. So there's a saying of the half that can be said, and when this goes well, it doubles as a saying which says there's another half that cannot be said. In other words, what we have here is an other half saying. Hence, I believe, Lacan's continued emphasis on the that's not it that he developed the previous year in Seminar 19, or worse. What can be said and known about feminine enjoyment is that what can be said and known about feminine enjoyment is not all there is to say about it. Like I said, it gets gooey in here, but this is the really important part. What can be said and known about feminine enjoyment is that what can be said and known about feminine enjoyment, that's not all there is to say about it. The best, and perhaps the only, way to say the possible into existence, as we see on the screen in front of us, is to say the existence of the impossible. If you want a formula for this, if you're looking for a mantra that goes with this, it goes like so. The best and perhaps the only way to say the possible into existence is to say the existence of the impossible, which always functions as a this ain't it. Hence, also, I'd say, those mystics we've been considering, who enjoy saying they experience another mode of enjoyment, an other enjoyment about which they can only say and know that they experience it. Recall the work we did with those mystics. And by experience, again, I mean sensory experience, from Lacan's use of the French éprouver, meaning feeling, as in bodily sensation. See where we're headed with this? Relative to mystical experience, in all its impossibility, the mystic who speaks is less a knowing subject than a body of knowledge. Their knowledge of mystical experience, in other words, is corporal. It may be without a subject, but it is not without a body. And it's a body that speaks in excess, overflowing the field of conscious knowledge, yours, mine, and theirs alike. She can feel it in her bones. there's more to her enjoyment than the act and fact of saying as much. And some, but not all, of her enjoyment finds contingent corporal expression in the phallic field as an embodied act of saying just this: not all of my enjoyment is on display here, motherfucker. Which brings us back, I think, to the key point in all of this, that third aspect of feminine enjoyment, the not whole part of feminine enjoyment. Because feminine enjoyment never fully appears in the phallic field, but also never fully remains beyond it, there is simply no such thing as a whole, complete, self-same, singular mode of feminine enjoyment. Hear me now. Everywhere she enjoys, she is not whole, but multiple instead, innumerably so, in fact. As such, it seems to me, woman with a capital W cannot and does not exist in and beyond the field of phallic enjoyment. The essence of woman, womanliness, is not. So also, I'm telling you, when it comes to feminine enjoyment. Like the one, in all its guises, autonomy, fusion with another, the sexual rapport, and every other universal we've discussed in this series so far, there's just no such thing as feminine enjoyment as a single, self-identical, totalizable, closed field of experience. Her enjoyment is a multiplicity without limit. And this, my friends, is the crucial part of that economy of jouissance on which we have our fingertips at the end of Chapter 9 in Seminar 20. Feminine enjoyment remains what it's been since the start of this seminar, an open set.